讀你聽嘅時間。今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第53節。呢節嘅名叫做 Of the troublous end and termination Sancho Panza's government came to。 睇個題目係 Sancho 嘅管治咧將會終結，究竟發生咩事咧？講翻上一回先，咪一個好簡短嘅章節，主要係講Don Quixote佢應承咗呢個女管家 Rodriguez 佢嘅請求，去揾 Rodriguez 嘅女嘅悔婚人，逼佢咧娶佢個女，用嘅方法係決鬥嘅形式。伯爵咧亦都會出手相助，去揾呢個人翻嚟，將呢個人送俾 Don Quixote 喺伯爵家嘅城堡去進行決鬥。於是乎 Rodriguez 就好欣然咁離開。之後咧就有傳信，就話傳信俾 Sancho 嘅太太 Teresa 呢個使者翻嚟啦。咁啊拎住啲書信咧就朗讀俾大家聽。當伯爵夫人讀咗啲內容出嚟之後咧，大家咧好開心，覺得咧佢答得好得體，亦都內容好豐富，令大家咧都笑顏睡開。好啦，我哋睇下呢一節 Sancho 呢一邊係出咗啲咩大事。
To fancy that in this life anything belonging to it will remain forever in the same state is an idle fancy. On the contrary, in it everything seems to go in a circle, I mean round and round. The spring succeeds the summer the fall the autumn the winter, and the winter the spring, and so time rolls with never-ceasing wheel. Man's life alone, swifter than time, speeds onward to its end without any hope of renewal.Save it to be in that other life which is endless and boundless. Thus saith Sid Hamate, the Mahometan philosopher, for there are many that by the light of nature alone, without the light of faith, have a comprehension of the fleeting nature and instability of this present life and the endless duration of that eternal life we hope for. But our author is here speaking of the rapidity with which Sancho's government came to an end, melted away, disappeared,vanished as it were in smoke and shadow. For as he lay in bed on the night of the 7th day of his government, sated, not with bread and wine, but with delivering judgments and giving opinions and making laws and proclamations, just as sleep, in spite of hunger, was beginning to close his eyelids, he heard such a noise of bell ringing and shouting that one would have fancied the whole island was going to the bottom.He sat up in bed and remained listening intently to try if he could make out what could be the cause of so great an uproar. Not only, however, was he unable to discover what it was, but as countless drums and trumpets now helped to swell the din of the bells and shouts, he was more puzzled than ever, and filled with fear and terror. And getting up, he put on a pair of slippers because of the dampness of the floor, and without throwing a dressing gown or anything of the kind over him,He rushed out of the door of his room, just in time to see approaching along a corridor a band of more than 20 persons with lighted torches and naked swords in their hands, all shouting out, to arms, Signor Governor, to arms! The enemy is in the island in countless numbers, and we are lost unless your skill and valor come to our support. Keeping up this noise, tumult, and uproar, they came to where Sancho stood dazed and bewildered by what he saw and heard.And as they approached, one of them called out to him, Arm at once, your lordship, if you would not have yourself destroyed and the whole island lost. What have I to do with arming? Said Sancho. What do I know about arms or supports? Better leave all that to my master Don Quixote, who will settle it and make all safe in a trice. For I, sinner that I am, God help me, don't understand these scuffles. Ah, Signor Governor, said another, what slackness of metal this is.Arm yourself. Here are arms for you, offensive and defensive. Come out to the plaza and be our leader and captain. It falls upon you by right, for you are our governor. Army then, in God's name, said Sancho, and they at once produced 2 large shields they had come provided with, and placed them upon him over his shirt, without letting him put on anything else, one shield in front and the other behind, and passing his arms through openings they had made.They bound him tight with ropes, so that there he was walled and boarded up as straight as spindle and unable to bend his knees or stir a single step. In his hand they placed a lance, on which he leant to keep himself from falling, And as soon as they had him thus fixed, they bade him march forward and lead them on, and give them all courage. For with him for their guide and lamp and morning star, they were sure to bring their business to a successful issue. "How am I to march, unlucky being that I am?" said Sancho, "when I can't stir my kneecaps? For these sports I have bound so tight to my body won't let me. What you must do is carry me in your arms, and lay me across or set me upright in some postern, and I'll hold it either with this lance or with my body." "Oh, Signor Governor," cried another, "it is fear more than the boards that keeps you from moving. Make haste, stir yourself, for there is no time to lose. The enemy is increasing in numbers, the shouts grow louder, and the danger is pressing." Urged by these exhortations and reproaches, the poor governor made an attempt to advance, but fell to the ground with such a crash that he fancied he had broken himself all to pieces. There he lay like a tortoise enclosed in its shell, or a side of bacon between two kneading troughs, or a boat bottomed up on the beach. Nor did the gang of jokers feel any compassion for him when they saw him down. So far from that, extinguishing their torches, they began to shout afresh and to renew the calls to arms with such energy, trampling on poor Sancho, and slashing at him over the shield with their swords in such a way that, if he had not gathered himself together and made himself small and drawn in his head between the shields, it would have fared badly with the poor governor. As, squeezed into that narrow compass, he lay, sweating and sweating again, and commending himself with all his heart to God to deliver him from his present peril. Some stumbled over him, others fell upon him, and one there was who took up a position on top of him for some time, and from thence, as if from a watchtower, issued orders to the troops, shouting out, "Here our side, here the enemy is thickest. Hold the breach there, shut that gate, barricade those ladders. Here with your stink pots of pitch and resin and kettles of boiling oil, block the streets with feather beds." In short, in his ardor he mentioned every little thing, and every implement and engine of war by means of which an assault upon the city is warded off, while the bruised and battered Sancho, who heard and suffered all, was saying to himself, "Oh, if it would only please the Lord to let the island be lost at once, and I could see myself either dead or out of this torture." Heaven heard his prayer, and when he least expected it, he heard voices exclaiming, "Victory, victory! The enemy retreats beaten. Come, Signor Governor, get up, and come and enjoy the victory and to fight the spoils that have been won from the foe by the might of that invisible arm." "Lift me up," said the wretched Sancho in a woe-begone voice. They helped him to rise, and as soon as he was on his feet said, "The enemy I have beaten you may nail to my forehead. I don't want to defy the spoils of the foe. I only beg and entreat some friend, if I have one, to give me a sup of wine, for I am parched with thirst, and wipe me dry, for I am turning to water." They rubbed him down, fetched him wine, and unbound the shields, and he seated himself upon his bed, and with fear, agitation, and fatigue he fainted away. Those who had been concerned in the joke were now sorry they had pushed it so far. However, the anxiety his fainting away had caused him was relieved by his returning to himself. He asked what o'clock it was. They told him it was just daybreak. He said no more, and in silence began to dress himself, while all watched him, waiting to see what the haste with which he was putting on his clothes meant. He got himself dressed at last, and then slowly, for he was sorely bruised and could not go fast, he proceeded to the stable, followed by all who were present, and going up to Dapple embraced him and gave him a loving kiss on the forehead, and said to him, not without tears in his eyes, "Come along, comrade and friend and partner of my toils and sorrows. When I was with you and had no cares to trouble me except mending your harness and feeding your little carcass, happy were my hours, my days and my years. But since I left you and mounted the towers of ambition and pride, 1,000 miseries, 1,000 troubles, and 4,000 anxieties have entered into my soul." And all the while he was speaking in this strain, he was fixing the pack saddle on the ass, without a word from anyone. Then having Dapple saddled, he, with great pain and difficulty, got up on him, and addressing himself to the major domo, the secretary, the head carver, the Pedro Recio, the doctor, and several others who stood by, he said, "Make way, gentlemen, and let me go back to my old freedom. Let me go look for my past life, and raise myself up from this present death. I was not born to be a governor or protect islands or cities from the enemies that choose to attack them. Plowing and digging, fine dressing and pruning are more in my way than defending provinces or kingdoms. St. Peter is very well at Rome. I mean, each of us is best following the trade he was born to. A reaping hook fits my hand better than a governor's scepter. I'd rather have my fill of gazpacho than be subject to the misery of a meddling doctor who kills me with hunger. And I'd rather lie in summer under the shade of an oak, and in winter wrap myself in a double sheepskin jacket in freedom, than go to bed between holland sheets and dress in sables under the restraint of a gunman. God be with your worships, and tell my Lord the Duke that naked I was born, naked I find myself. I neither lose nor gain. I mean that without a farthing I came into this government, and without a farthing I go out of it. Very different from the way governors commonly leave at the islands. Stand aside and let me go. I have to plaster myself, for I believe every one of my ribs is crushed, thanks to the enemies that have been trampling over me tonight. That is unnecessary, Signor Governor, said Dr. Recio, for I will give your worship a draught against falls and bruises that will soon make you as sound and strong as ever. And as for your diet, I promise your worship to behave better and let you eat plentifully of whatever you like. You spoke late, said Sancho. I'd as soon turn Turk as stay any longer. Those jokes won't pass a second time. By God, I'd as soon remain in this government or take another, even if it was offered me between two plates, as fly to heaven without wings. I am of the breed of the Panzas, and they are every one of them obstinate. And if they once say odds, odds it must be, no matter if it is evens, in spite of all the well. Here in this stable I leave the ants' wings that lifted me up into the air for the swifts and other birds to eat me. And let's take the level ground and our feet once more. And if they're not shod in pink shoes of Cordovan, they won't want for rough sandals of hemp. Every ewe to her like, and let no one stretch his leg beyond the length of the sheet. And now let me pass, for it's growing late with me. To this the majordomo said, Signor Governor, we would let your worship go with all our hearts, though it sorely grieves us to lose you, for your wit and Christian conduct naturally make us regret you. But it is well known that every governor, before he leaves the place where he has been governing, is bound first of all to render an account. Let your worship do so for the 10 days you have held the government, and then you may go, and the peace of God go with you. No one can demand it of me, said Sancho, but he whom my lord the Duke shall appoint. I am going to meet him, and to him I will render an exact one. Besides, when I go forth naked as I do, there is no other proof needed to show that I have governed like an angel. By God, the great Sancho is right, said Dr. Recio, and we should let him go, for the Duke will be beyond measure glad to see him. They all agreed to this, and allowed him to go, first offering to bear him company and furnish him with all he wanted for his own comfort or for the journey. Sancho said he did not want anything more than a little barley for Dapple, and half a cheese and half a loaf for himself. For the distance being so short, there was no occasion for any better or bulkier provant. They all embraced him, and he with tears embraced all of them, and left them filled with admiration not only at his remarks, but at his firm and sensible resolution. 呢一節就終於知道咗 Sancho 點解要辭職失去佢呢個管治者嘅身份，呢個職位係佢自己放棄嘅。點解呢？就因為敵人打到嚟啊！敵人喺邊度嚟嘅呢？唔知，佢淨係知道有幾十個敵人帶住武器就向佢嘅小島衝嚟。咁佢作為管治者，佢係有義務有責任係披甲上陣去抵禦嘅。Sancho 當刻就即刻話：呢啲嘢唔係我做㗎，呢啲係我主人當吉訶德去做。咁但係當吉訶德呢一刻就唔喺佢身邊。咁於是乎咧，佢自己就要硬住頭皮披甲上陣。當然佢一上場就俾眾人圍毆啦。好彩咧就有兩個大盾就保住佢自己好似隻龜咁，龜縮住咁啊又唔俾人打。咁但係打完之後咧，佢都決定咧唔可以繼續落去啦。佢真係冇呢個資格做管治者，佢係一個 Panza。Panza 咧就係固執嘅 ，Panza 咧話唔做咧就唔做，我就唔會同你哋去 bargain 討價還價，我就係唔想做，因為實在太辛苦啦。 又冇啖好食，朝不保夕，好忙，而且咧而家咧仲要俾人毒打，而我根本咧就冇呢個武力去維持治安，更加唔好話咧去保住自己嘅命仔啦。於是乎咧，佢就即時走去佢個女仔嘅 Dapple 嗰度，就同佢哭訴啦。唔得啦，我而家咧就要騎隻女仔離開啦。眾人咧就話啊，我哋會好掛住你啊，雖然你只係喺度管治咗個9日，你有啲咩想要啊？最後 Sancho 只係要求 Dapple 有少少我講草啦，佢自己咧少少麵包芝士，咁就上路離開，同大家說再見。呢一節冇咩字同大家分享，我哋下一節再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。
大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第54節，呢一節嘅名叫做 Which deals with matters relating to this history and no other。上一回咧就講到 Sancho 終於都抵受唔住作為管治者嘅煎熬，被入侵嘅敵人毒打之後咧，佢決定唔能夠勝任啊，同大家辭請，表明佢係唔會再翻嚟，佢只係想做翻一個平凡人，繼續做 Don Quixote 嘅侍從都好。總之咧，佢就要騎上佢嘅女仔 Dapple 咧上路啦。咁我呢一節咧就睇下 Sancho 離開咗小島之後，會唔會有佢繼續嘅消息啦。
The Duke and Duchess resolved that the challenge Don Quixote had, for the reason already mentioned, given their vassal, should be proceeded with, and as the young man was in Flanders, whither he had fled to escape having Donna Rodriguez for a mother-in-law, they arranged to substitute for him a Gascon lackey named Tassilos, first of all carefully instructing him in all he had to do. 2 days later, the Duke told Don Quixote that in 4 days from that time, his opponent would present himself on the field of battle armed as a knight, and would maintain that the damsel lied by half a beard, nay, a whole beard, if she affirmed that he had given her a promise of marriage. Don Quixote was greatly pleased at the news, and promised himself to do wonders in the lists, and reckoned it rare good fortune that an opportunity should have offered for letting his noble hosts see what the might of his strong arm was capable of. And so, in high spirits and satisfaction, he awaited the expiration of the 4 days, which measured by his impatience seemed spinning themselves out into 400 ages. Let us leave them to pass, as we do other things, and go and bear Sancho company, as mounted on Dapple, half glad, half sad, he paced along on his road to join his master, in whose society he was happier than in being governor of all the islands in the world. Well then, it so happened that before he had gone a great way from the island of his government, he saw coming along the road he was travelling 6 pilgrims with staffs, foreigners of that sort that beg for alms singing, who as they drew near arranged themselves in a line, and lifting up their voices all together began to sing in their own language something that Sancho could not understand, with the exception of one word which sounded plainly alms, from which he gathered that it was alms they asked for in their song. And being, as Cid Hamete says, remarkably charitable, he took out of his alforjas the half loaf and half cheese he had been provided with, and gave them to them, explaining to them by signs that he had nothing else to give them. They received them very gladly, but exclaimed, "Geld, geld." "I don't understand what you want of me, good people," said Sancho. On this, one of them took a purse out of his bosom and showed it to Sancho, by which he comprehended they were asking for money, and putting his thumb to his throat and spreading his hand upwards, he gave them to understand that he had not the sign of a coin about him, and urging Dapple forward, he broke through them. But as he was passing, one of them who had been examining him very closely rushed towards him, and flinging his arms round him, exclaimed in a loud voice and good Spanish, "God bless me! What's this I see? Is it possible that I hold in my arms my dear friend, my good neighbor Sancho Panza? But there's no doubt about it, for I am not asleep, nor am I drunk just now." Sancho was surprised to hear himself called by his name and find himself embraced by a foreign pilgrim, and after regarding him steadily without speaking, he was still unable to recognize him. But the pilgrim, perceiving his perplexity, cried, "What! And is it possible, Sancho Panza, that thou dost not know thy neighbor Ricote, the Morisco shopkeeper of thy village? Sancho, upon this, looking at him more carefully, began to recall his features, and at last recognized him perfectly, and without getting off the ass, threw his arms round his neck, saying, Who the devil could have known thee, Ricote, in this mummers dress thou art in? Tell me, who has Frenchified thee, and how dost thou dare to return to Spain, where if they catch thee and recognize thee, it will go hard enough with thee? If thou dost not betray me, Sancho, said the pilgrim, I am safe, for in this dress no one will recognize me. But let us turn aside out of the road into that grove there where my comrades are going to eat and rest, and thou shalt eat with them there, for they are very good fellows. I'll have time enough to tell thee then all that has happened me since I left our village in obedience to His Majesty's edict that threatened such severities against the unfortunate people of my nation, as thou hast heard. Sancho complied, and Ricote, having spoken to the other pilgrims, they withdrew to the grove they saw, turning a considerable distance out of the road. They threw down their staffs, took off their pilgrims' cloaks, and remained in their underclothing. They were all good-looking young fellows, except Ricote, who was a man somewhat advanced in years. They carried alforjas, all of them, and all apparently well-filled, at least with things provocative of thirst, such as would summon it from 2 leagues off. They stretched themselves on the ground, and making a tablecloth of the grass, they spread upon it bread, salt, knives, walnuts, scraps of cheese, and well-picked ham bones, which, if they were past gnawing, were not past sucking. They also put down a black dainty called, they say, caviar, and made of the eggs of fish, a great thirst wakener. Nor was there any lack of olives, dry, it is true, and without any seasoning, but for all that toothsome and pleasant. But what made the best show in the field of the banquet was 6 bottles of wine, for each of them produced his own from his alforjas. Even the good Ricote, who from a Morisco had transformed himself into a German or Dutchman, took out his, which in size might have feed with the 5 others. They then began to eat with very great relish and very leisurely, making the most of each morsel, very small ones of everything. They took up on the point of the knife, and then all at the same moment raised their arms and bottles aloft, the mouths placed in their mouths, and all eyes fixed on heaven, just as if they were taking aim at it. And in this attitude they remained ever so long, wagging their heads from side to side, as if in acknowledgment of the pleasure they were enjoying, while they decanted the bowels of the bottles into their own stomachs. Sancho beheld all, and nothing gave him pain. So far from that, acting on the proverb he knew so well, when thou art at Rome, do as thou seest. He asked Ricote for his spotter and took aim like the rest of them, and with not less enjoyment. 4 times did the botters spare being uplifted, but the 5th it was all in vain, for they were drier and more sapless than a rush by that time, which made the jollity that had been kept up so far begin to flag. Every now and then someone of them would grab Sancho's right hand in his own, saying, Spaniard and German, all of them good partners. And Sancho would answer, Good partners, God swears, and then go off into a fit of laughter that lasted an hour, without a thought for the moment of anything that had befallen him in his government, for cares have very little sway over us while we are eating and drinking. At length, the wine having come to an end with them, drowsiness began to come over them, and they dropped asleep on their very table and tablecloth. Ricote and Sancho alone remained awake, for they had eaten more and drunk less. And Ricote drawing Sancho aside, they seated themselves at the foot of the beach, leaving the pilgrims buried in sweet sleep. And without once falling into his own Morisco tongue, Ricote spoke as follows in pure Castilian. Thou knowest well, neighbor and friend Sancho Panza, how the proclamation or edict His Majesty commanded to be issued against those of my nation filled us all with terror and dismay. Me at least it did, in so much that I think before the time granted us for quitting Spain was out, the full force of the penalty had already fallen upon me and upon my children. I decided then, and I think wisely, I say, to leave the town myself, alone and without my family, and go to seek out some place to remove them to comfortably, and not in the hurried way in which the others took the departure. For I saw very plainly, and so did all the older men among us, that the proclamations were not mere threats, as some said, but positive enactments which would be enforced at the appointed time. And what made me believe this was what I knew of the base and extravagant designs which our people harbor. the signs of such a nature that I think it was divine inspiration that moved His Majesty to carry out a resolution so spirited, not that we were all guilty. For some there were true and steadfast Christians, but they were so few that they could make no head against those who were not. And it was not prudent to cherish a viper in the bosom by having enemies in the house. In short, it was with just cause that we were visited with the penalty of banishment, a mild and lenient one in the eyes of some, but to us the most terrible that could be inflicted upon us. Wherever we are, we weep for Spain. For after all, we were born there, and it is our natural fatherland. Nowhere do we find the reception our unhappy condition needs, and in Barbary and all the parts of Africa where we counted upon being received, succored, and welcomed, it is there they insult and ill-treat us most. We knew not our good fortune until we lost it, and such is the longing we almost all of us have to return to Spain, that most of those who like myself know the language, and there are many who do, come back to it and leave their wives and children forsaken yonder, so great is their love for it. And now I know by experience the meaning of the saying, sweet is the love of one's country. I left our village, as I said, and went to France, but though they gave us a kind reception there, I was anxious to see all I could. I crossed into Italy and reached Germany, and there it seemed to me we might live with more freedom, as the inhabitants do not pay any attention to trifling points. Everyone lives as he likes, for in most parts they enjoy liberty of conscience. I took a house in a town near Augsburg, and then joined these pilgrims, who are in the habit of coming to Spain in great numbers every year to visit the shrines there, which they look upon as their Indies and a sure and certain source of gain. They travel nearly all of it, and there is no town out of which they do not go full up of meat and drink, as the saying is, and with a real, at least in money, they come off at the end of their travels with more than 100 crowns saved, which, changed into gold, they smuggle out of the kingdom, either in the hollow of their staffs, or in the patches of their pilgrims' clothes, or by some device of their own, and carry to their own country in spite of the guards at the posts and passes where they are searched. Now my purpose is, Sancho, to carry away the treasure that I left buried, which, as it is outside the town, I shall be able to do without risk, and to write or cross over from Valencia to my daughter and wife, who I know are at Algiers, and find some means of bringing them to some French port and thence to Germany, there to await what it may be God's will to do with us. For, after all, Sancho, I know well that Ricote, my daughter, and Francisca Ricote, my wife, are Catholic Christians, and though I am not so much so, still I am more of a Christian than a Moor, and it is always my prayer to God that He will open the eyes of my understanding and show me how I am to serve Him. But what amazes me, and I cannot understand, is why my wife and daughter should have gone to Barbary rather than to France, where they could live as Christians. To this Sancho replied, Remember, Ricote, that may not have been open to them. For Juan Teopio, thy wife's brother, took them, and being a true Moor, he went where he could go most easily. And another thing I can tell thee, it is my belief thou art going in vain to look for what thou hast left buried. For we heard they took from thy brother-in-law and thy wife a great quantity of pearls and money in gold, which they brought to be passed. That may be, said Ricote, but I know they did not touch my hoard, for I did not tell them where it was, for fear of accidents. And so, if thou wilt come with me, Sancho, and help me to take it away and conceal it, I will give thee 200 crowns, wherewith thou mayest relieve thy necessities, and as thou knowest, I know they are many. I would do it, said Sancho, but I am not at all covetous, for I gave up an office this morning in which, if I was, I might have made the walls of my house of gold and dined off silver plates before 6 months were over. And so, for this reason, and because I feel I would be guilty of treason to my king if I help his enemies, I would not go with thee if instead of promising me 200 crowns, thou wert to give me 400 here in hand. And what office is this thou hast given up, Sancho? Asked Ricote. I have given up being governor of an island, said Sancho, and such a one, faith, as you won't find the like of easily. And where is this island? Said Ricote. Where? Said Sancho. 2 leagues from here, and it is called the island of Barataria. Nonsense, Sancho, said Ricote. Islands are away out in the sea. There are no islands on the mainland. What? No islands? Said Sancho. I tell thee, friend Ricote, I left it this morning, and yesterday I was governing there as I pleased like a Sagittarius, but for all that I gave it up, for it seemed to me a dangerous office, a governess. And what hast thou gained by the government? Asked Ricote. I have gained, said Sancho, the knowledge that I am no good for governing, unless it is a drove of cattle, and that the riches that are to be got by these governments are got at the cost of one's rest and sleep, aye, and even one's food. For in islands the governors must eat little, especially if they have doctors to look after their health. I don't understand thee, Sancho, said Ricote, but it seems to me all nonsense thou art talking. Who would give thee islands to govern? Is there any scarcity in the world of cleverer men that thou art for governors? Hold thy peace, Sancho, and come back to thy senses, and consider whether thou wilt come with me, as I said, to help me to take away treasure I left buried, and I will give thee wherewithal to keep thee, as I told thee. And I have told thee already, Ricote, that I will not, said Sancho. Let it content thee that by me thou shalt not be betrayed, and go thy way in God's name, and let me go mine. For I know that well-gotten gain may be lost, but ill-gotten gain is lost, itself and its owner likewise. I will not press thee, Sancho, said Ricote, but tell me, wert thou in our village where my wife and daughter and brother-in-law left it? I was so, said Sancho, and I can tell thee thy daughter left it looking so lovely that all the village turned out to see her, and everybody said she was the fairest creature in the world. She wept as she went, and embraced all her friends and acquaintances and those who came out to see her, and she begged them all to commend her to God and Our Lady his mother, and this in such a touching way that it made me weep myself, though I am not much given to tears commonly, and faith, many a one would have liked to hide her, or go out and carry her off on the road. But the fear of going against the king's command kept them back. The one who showed himself most moved was Don Pedro Gregorio, the rich young heir thou knowest of, and they say he was deep in love with her, and since she left he has not been seen in our village again, and we all suspect he has gone after her to steal her away, but so far nothing has been heard of it. I always had a suspicion that gentleman had a passion for my daughter, said Ricote, but as I felt sure of my Ricote's virtue, it gave me no uneasiness to know that he loved her. For thou must have heard it said, Sancho, that the Morisco women seldom or never engage in amours with the old Christians, and my daughter, who I fancy thought more of being a Christian than of love-making, would not trouble herself about the attentions of this heir. God grant it, said Sancho, for it would be a bad business for both of them. But now let me be off, friend Ricote, for I want to reach where my master Don Quixote is tonight. God be with thee, brother Sancho, said Ricote. My comrades are beginning to stir, and it is time, too, for us to continue our journey. And then they both embraced, and Sancho mounted Dapple, and Ricote leaned upon his staff, and so departed.
呢一節就讀到嚟呢一度。呢一節就有提到少少當期開題嘅事，伯爵家嗰度咧就收到信息，悔婚者原來咧佢身在異鄉，就離伯爵家城堡咧就非常之遠，要短期內決鬥咧就唔可能，變咗咧伯爵夫婦就諗下好唔好求其揾一個奴僕就去替代悔婚者，咁啊呢個當期開題決鬥算啦。另一方面就講 Sancho 咁佢辭任之後嘅路上。他鄉遇故知喎，就係一班呢用僧袍覆蓋住自己嘅人，一班好似朝聖者咁樣嘅人，係講啲異國語言嘅，好似向 Sancho 乞食咁嘅狀態啦。Sancho 原本都認唔到呢個同鄉，但係咧呢個同鄉就自己表明身份話佢係 Ricote，佢其實離開咗西班牙好耐，遊歷咗好多嘅地方。終於去到德國呢個地方，發現到咦當地人個生活都好淳樸，好自由。佢認識到呢一班嘅朝聖者咧，每一年都會好規律咁樣咧嚟到西班牙度朝聖咧。實際上咧其實係會做一啲走私嘅，但係都唔會俾人查到嘅喎。Ricote咧就靈機一觸啦，就記得自己當年喺西班牙都有收埋咗啲財寶喺地下，於是乎想今次過嚟就挖起佢，有咗錢咧佢就可以同佢嘅妻子啊、佢嘅女啊就重聚啦。咁 Sancho 咧亦都提起佢個女，就話佢個女咧就俾一個有錢人家睇中咗喎，咁但係咧就兩個人當然係冇成婚啦。呢個有錢人咧就傳言就跟咗佢個女就離開咗西班牙。而 Ricote 咧嘅想法就係佢想 Sancho 同佢合夥一齊去挖出呢個寶藏，然之後咧就幫佢走私翻去德國。但係咧 Sancho 就斷然拒絕，佢話你無論俾幾多錢 分幾多裝俾我都冇用㗎啦，因為我唔會做啊，因為我啱啱咧先至辭咗任，作為一個島主，我連島主咁富貴我都辭任啦，我根本唔會貪圖你呢啲嘢啦。咁 Ricote 聽咗就話你做島主冇可能㗎喎，正常人都唔會揾你做啦。咁但係佢話無論點都好啦，你再三考慮下啦。Sancho 咧都係斷然拒絕咗。我哋睇下呢個字有啲咩字同大家分享。Lackey L-A-C-K-E-Y 名詞嚟嘅 ，a servant, especially a liveried footman or manservant， 一啲下人奴僕咁。Frenchify F-R-E-N-C-H French I-F-Y Frenchify 動詞 make French in form, character or manners。Edict E-D-I-C-T 名詞嚟嘅。An official order or proclamation issued by a person in authority， 法令。文中就有提到 Ricote 就係受到皇室嘅法令而佢受審嘅，咁佢咧就潛逃啦。好，我呢節讀到呢度，下一節仲大家讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽嘅時間。今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第55節，呢一節嘅名叫做 Of what befell Sancho on the road and other things that cannot be surpassed。 咁上一回咧就少少提到 Don Quixote 呢一邊伯爵就諗住求其揾一個下人就去代替培訓者同 Don Quixote 決鬥，諗住了事啦。另一方面咧 Sancho 辭咗佢嘅官職，返回工作假嘅路上，想同 Don Quixote 會合。咁但喺路上佢就遇到同鄉喎，咁佢都幾乎認唔到佢噶啦，因為咧佢都係着住好似傳教士道袍遮住自己。兩個坐低傾起上嚟，先知道原來佢個女咧同呢個有錢人相愛喎。但係其後佢個女都離開咗之後，呢個有錢人都好似跟咗上去。不過重點咧就係呢個同鄉佢收埋咗啲錢，埋咗喺地底，就想阿 Sancho 同佢一齊去掘呢啲財寶出嚟，然後走私翻去國外。但係 Sancho 都話：我有個大官唔做，我跟住做平，俾呢啲咁樣嘅小友話冇影響都冇嘅。咁佢咧就推辭咗。好啦，我哋睇下呢一節 Sancho 嘅歸途啊，會發生啲咩其他事啊？
The length of time he delayed with Ricote prevented Sancho from reaching the Duke's castle that day, though he was within half a league of it when night, somewhat dark and cloudy, overtook him. This, however, as it was summertime, did not give him much uneasiness, and he turned aside out of the road, intending to wait for morning. But his ill luck and hard fate so willed it that, as he was searching about for a place to make himself as comfortable as possible, he and Dapple fell into a deep, dark hole that lay among some very old buildings. As he fell, he commended himself with all his heart to God, fancying he was not going to stop until he reached the depths of the bottomless pit. But it did not turn out so. For a little more than thrice a man's height, Dapple touched bottom, and he found himself sitting on him without having received any hurt or damage whatever. He felt himself all over and held his breath to try whether he was quite sound or had a hole made in him anywhere. And finding himself all right and whole and in perfect health, he was profuse in his thanks to God our Lord for the mercy that had been shown him, for he made sure he had been broken into 1,000 pieces. He also felt along the sides of the pit with his hands to see if it were possible to get out of it without help, but he found they were quite smooth and afforded no hold anywhere, at which he was greatly distressed, especially when he heard how pathetically and dolefully Dapple was bemoaning himself, and no wonder he complained, nor was it from ill temper, for in truth he was not in a very good case. Alas, said Sancho, what unexpected accidents happen in every step to those who live in this miserable world. Who would have said that one who saw himself yesterday sitting on a throne, governor of an island, giving orders to his servants and his vassals, would see himself today buried in the pit without a soul to help him, or servant or vassal to come to his relief? Here must we perish with hunger, my ass and myself, if indeed we don't die first, he of his bruises and injuries, an eye of grief and sorrow. At any rate, I'll not be as lucky as my master Don Quixote of La Mancha when he went down into the cave of that enchanted Montesinos, where he found people to make more of him than if he had been in his own house. For it seems he came in for a table laid out and a bed ready-made. There he saw fair and pleasant visions, but here I'll see, I imagine, toads and adders. Unlucky wretch that I am! What an end my follies and fancies have come to! They'll take up my bones out of this, when it is heaven's will that I'm found picked clean, white and polished, and my good Dapples with them, and by that, perhaps, it will be found out who we are, at least by such as have heard that Sancho Panza never separated from his ass, nor his ass from Sancho Panza. Unlucky wretches, I say again, that our hard fate should not let us die in our own country and among our own people, where if there was no help for our misfortune, at any rate there would be someone to grieve for it and to close our eyes as we passed away. O comrade and friend, how ill have I repaid thy faithful services! Forgive me, and entreat fortune, as well as thou canst, to deliver us out of this miserable strait we are both in, and I promise to put a crown of laurel on thy head, and make thee look like a poet laureate, and give thee double feats. In this strain did Sancho bewail himself, and his ass listened to him, but answered him never a word, such was the distress and anguish the poor beast found himself in. At length, after a night spent in bitter moanings and lamentations, day came, and by its light Sancho perceived that it was wholly impossible to escape out of that pit without help, and he fell to bemoaning his fate and uttering loud shouts to find out if there was anyone within hearing. But all his shouting was only crying in the wilderness, for there was not a soul anywhere in the neighborhood to hear him. And then at last he gave himself up for dead. Dapple was lying on his back, and Sancho helped him to his feet, which he was scarcely able to keep. And then, taking a piece of bread out of his alforjas, which had shared their fortunes in the fall, he gave it to the ass, to whom it was not unwelcome, saying to him as if he understood him, "With bread all sorrows are less." And now he perceived on one side of the pit a hole large enough to admit a person if he stooped and squeezed himself into a small compass. Sancho made for it, and entered it by creeping, and found it wide and spacious on the inside, which he was able to see as a ray of sunlight that penetrated what might be called the roof, showed it all plainly. He observed too that it opened and widened out into another spacious cavity, seeing which he made his way back to where the ass was, and with a stone began to pick away the clay from the hole until in a short time he had made room for the beast to pass easily, and this accomplished, taking him by the halter, he proceeded to traverse the cavern to see if there was any outlet at the other end. He advanced, sometimes in the dark, sometimes without light, but never without fear. "God Almighty help me," said he to himself. "This that is a misadventure to me would make a good adventure for my master Don Quixote. He would have been sure to take these depths and dungeons for flowery gardens or the palaces of Galliena, and would have counted upon issuing out of this darkness and imprisonment into some blooming meadow. But I, unlucky that I am, hopeless and spiritless, expect at every step another pit deeper than the first to open under my feet and swallow me up for good. Welcome, evil, if thou comest along." In this way, and with these reflections, he seemed to himself to have travelled rather more than half a league, when at last he perceived a dim light that looked like daylight and found its way in on one side, showing that this road, which appeared to him the road to the other world, led to some opening. Here the Tamate leaves him, and returns to Don Quixote, who in high spirits and satisfaction was looking forward to the day fixed for the battle he was to fight with him who had robbed Dona Rodriguez's daughter of her honor, for whom he hoped to obtain satisfaction for the wrong and injury shamefully done to her. It came to pass, then, that having sallied forth one morning to practice and exercise himself in what he would have to do in the encounter he expected to find himself engaged in the next day, as he was putting Rocinante through his paces or pressing him to the charge, he brought his feet so close to a pit that, but for reining him in tightly, it would have been impossible for him to avoid falling into it. He pulled him up, however, without a fall, and coming a little closer examined the hole without dismounting. But as he was looking at it, he heard loud cries proceeding from it, and by listening attentively was able to make out that he who uttered them was saying, "Ho, about there! Is there any Christian that hears me, or any charitable gentleman that will take pity on a sinner buried alive, on an unfortunate discovered governor?" It struck Don Quixote that it was the voice of Sancho Panza he heard, whereat he was taken aback and amazed, and raising his own voice as much as he could, he cried out, "Who is below there? Who is that complaining?" "Who should be here, or who should complain?" was the answer, but to fall on Sancho Panza for his sins and for his ill-luck governor of the island of Barataria, squire that was to the famous knight Don Quixote of La Mancha. When Don Quixote heard this, his amazement was redoubled and his perturbation grew greater than ever, for it suggested itself to his mind that Sancho must be dead, and that his soul was in torment down there, and carried away by this idea, he exclaimed, "I conjure thee by everything that as a Catholic Christian I can conjure thee by, tell me who thou art, and if thou art a soul in torment, tell me what thou wouldst have me do for thee. For as my profession is to give aid and succor to those that need it in this world, it will also extend to aiding and succoring the distressed of the other who cannot help themselves." "In that case," answered the voice, "your worship who speaks to me must be my master Don Quixote of La Mancha. Nay, from the tone of that voice it is plain it can be nobody else." "Don Quixote I am," replied Don Quixote, "he whose profession it is to aid and succor the living and the dead in their necessities. Wherefore tell me who thou art, for thou art keeping me in suspense. Because if thou art my squire, Sancho Panza, and art dead, since the devils have not carried thee off, and thou art by God's mercy in purgatory, our Holy Mother, the Roman Catholic Church, has intercessory means sufficient to release thee from the pains thou art in, and I, for my part, will plead with her to that end, so far as my substance will go. Without further delay, therefore, declare thyself and tell me who thou art." "By all that's good," was the answer, "and by the birth of whomsoever your worship chooses, I swear, Señor Don Quixote of La Mancha, that I am your squire, Sancho Panza, and that I have never died all my life, but that, having given up my government for reasons that would require more time to explain, I fell last night into this pit where I am now, and Dapple is witness and won't let me lie, for more by token he is here with me." Nor was this all. One would have fancied he had understood what Sancho said, because that moment he began to bray so loudly that the whole cave rang again. "Famous testimony!" exclaimed Don Quixote. "I know that bray as well as if I was its mother, and thy voice too, my Sancho. Wait while I go to the Duke's castle, which is close by, and I will bring someone to take thee out of this pit into which thy sins no doubt have brought thee." "Go, your worship," said Sancho, "and come back quick for God's sake, for I cannot bear being buried alive any longer, and I'm dying of fear." Don Quixote left him, and hastened to the castle to tell the Duke and Duchess what had happened to Sancho, and they were not a little astonished at it. They could easily understand his having fallen, from the confirmatory circumstance of the cave, which had been in existence there from time immemorial. But they could not imagine how he had quitted the government without their receiving any intimation of his coming. To be brief, they fetched ropes and tackle, as the saying is, and by dint of many hands and much labor they drew up Dapple and Sancho Panza out of the darkness into the light of day. A student who saw him remarked, "That's the way all bad governors should come out of their governments, as this sinner comes out of the depths of the pit, dead with hunger, pale, and I suppose without a farthing." Sancho overheard him and said, "It is 8 or 10 days, brother Growler, since I entered upon the government of the island that gave me, and all that time I never had a belly full of victuals, no, not for an hour. Doctors persecuted me, and enemies crushed my bones, nor had I any opportunity of taking bribes or levying taxes. And if that be the case, as it is, I don't deserve, I think, to come out in this fashion. But man proposes and God disposes, and God knows what is best, and what suits each one best, and as the occasion, so the behavior. And let nobody say, I won't drink of this water, and where one thinks there are flitches, there are no pegs. God knows my meaning, and that's enough. I say no more, though I could." "Be not angry or annoyed at what thou hearest, Sancho," said Don Quixote, "or there will never be an end of it. Keep a safe conscience, and let them say what they like. For trying to stop slanderous tongues is like trying to put gates to the open plain, If a governor comes out of his government rich, they say he has been a thief. And if he comes out poor, that he has been a noodle and a blockhead. They'll be pretty sure this time, said Sancho, to set me down for a fool rather than a thief. Thus talking, and surrounded by boys and a crowd of people, they reached the castle, where in one of the corridors the Duke and Duchess stood waiting for them. But Sancho would not go up to see the Duke until he had first put up Dapple in the stable, for he said he had passed a very bad night in his last quarters. Then he went upstairs to see his lord and lady, and kneeling before them, he said, "Because it was your highness's pleasure, not because of any desert of my own, I went to govern your island of Barataria, which I entered naked, and naked I find myself. I neither lose nor gain. Whether I have governed well or ill, I have had witnesses who will say what they think fit. I have answered questions, I have decided courses, and always dying of hunger. For Dr. Pedro Recio of Tertifera, the island and governor doctor, would have it so. Enemies attacked us by night and put us in a great quandary, but the people of the island say they came off safe and victorious by the might of my arm, and may God give them as much health as there's truth in what they say. In short, during that time I have weighed the cares and responsibilities governing brings with it, and by my reckoning I find my shoulders can't bear them, nor are they a load for my loins or arrows of my quiver. And so, before the government threw me over, I prefer to throw the government over. And yesterday morning I left the island as I found it, with the same streets, houses, and roofs it had when I entered it. I asked no loan of anybody, nor did I try to fill my pocket, and though I meant to make some useful laws, I made hardly any, as I afraid they would not be kept. For in that case it comes to the same thing to make them or not to make them. I quitted the island, as I said, without any escort except my ass. I fell into a pit. I pushed on through it, until this morning by the light of the sun I saw an outlet, but not so easy a one but that, had not heaven sent me my master Don Quixote, I'd have stayed there till the end of the world. So now, my lord and lady Duke and Duchess, here is your governor Sancho Panza, who in the bare 10 days he has held the government has come by the knowledge that he would not give anything to be governor, not to say of an island, but of the whole world. And that point being settled, kissing your worship's feet, and imitating the game of the boys when they say, "Leap thou and give me one," I take a leap out of the government and pass into the service of my master Don Quixote. For after all, though in it I eat my bread in fear and trembling, at any rate I take my fill. And for my part, so long as I'm full, it's all alike to me whether it's with carrots or with partridges. Here Sancho brought his long speech to an end, Don Quixote having been the whole time in dread of his uttering a host of absurdities, and when he found him leave off with so few, he thanked heaven in his heart. The Duke embraced Sancho and told him he was heartily sorry he had given up the government so soon, but that he would see that he was provided with some other post on his estate less onerous and more profitable. The Duchess also embraced him, and gave orders that he should be taken good care of, as it was plain to see he had been badly treated and worse bruised.
我呢一節咧就用咗好長嘅篇幅講咧 Sancho 就連人帶嚟跌咗個窿度，呼叫咗好耐咧都冇人理佢。最尾機緣巧合之下，你路過嘅 Don Quixote 咧發現救咗佢上嚟。之前咧 Don Quixote 就以為係 Sancho 嘅鬼魂，根本就唔相信呢個係 Sancho， 直至到咧 Sancho 話呢個真係我嚟㗎咁樣之後先救佢上嚟。救咗上嚟之後 ，Sancho 就對住所有人，包括公爵夫婦在內。就同佢哋講話，我真係唔係一個管治者嘅料，我喺呢個島上面呢，冇啖好食，又俾人毒打，但係呢，我又從來冇亂咁收稅，收受啲咩利益好處，我係點樣嚟呢就點樣走，我唯一不得可惜呢，就係我冇頒布啲咩有用嘅法令，雖然佢有少少嘅，但係即係唔足夠啦，當然，咁呢佢就離開咗啦，佢呢希望可以重新為當時我哋嘅侍從。好，我睇下呢一節有啲咩字同大家分享。confirmatory C-O-N-F-I-R-M confirmatory A-T-O-R-Y 形容詞 serving to establish the truth or correctness of something that is suspected or reported 可以用嚟公證嘅提供一啲證據嘅意思，公證。victual 呢個古字嚟嘅名詞 food or provisions 一係就係食物飲料，一係就係提供食物飲料。Quandary, Q-U-A-N-D-A-R-Y 名詞。A state of perplexity or uncertainty over what to do in a difficult situation， 處於猶豫中啦，處於個困境中啦，好難去做抉擇嘅。好，我呢節到佢呢度，下一節再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。